I'm Kelly Testi, the Executive Director and CEO of the Association of American Law Schools, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this presidential plenary session on courage in action. As we begin this morning, I want us all, of course, to remain mindful of the terrible tragedy unfolding in Los Angeles. We are in touch with the law schools there. We know that so many of their community and so many others have been deeply affected, losing homes. My own nephew lost his home yesterday in Altadena, and we will continue to offer all support we can to our colleagues. And as we gather here, I know there's always the question when tragedy unfolds, what do you do? And I think for law, the answer is most always we need to press on, whether it's about zoning or climate change, or it's the way that different communities are differentially affected by tragedy. Law has a role in all of that. And so as we keep all of those people and the first responders in LA in mind, let us continue to do our good work of building the rule of law and building democracy across the U.S. So thank you very much for joining us. I am really pleased now to introduce the president of the Association of American Law Schools, Melanie Wilson, and then turn this panel to her to moderate and direct. And as I do that, I want to let you know that she is currently the Dean and Roy L. Steinheimer Jr. Professor of Law at Washington and Lee, and just a wonderful leader that started that position in 2022. She, before that, had been the dean at Tennessee and had a wonderful term there as dean, and prior to that was at Kansas as a law professor, where she is an expert in criminal procedure, focused on the Fourth and Sixth Amendment and the role of prosecutors, and has been an award-winning teacher and scholar. And much of that contribution comes from the fact that not only is Melanie a wonderful academic, she was a longtime practitioner before entering academia, and so is able to really blend that perspective when working with her students. And so we're so fortunate to have a teacher, a scholar, a servant leader of the wonderful dimensions of Melanie Wilson serving this year as president of the Association of American Law Schools. And thank you. Let's recognize her. It's been a particular joy for me, given that this is my first year, to have such a wonderful person to begin my tenure with and to see her model of leadership. And I think that when you think about her theme of courage in action, she has been a wonderful example of that. I know that it's easy to rip off the statistics about where people have served and all of this, but I admire so much the fact that she is a kind leader, she is a savvy leader, she has excellent judgment, and she has an ethical compass that just doesn't waver. And when you think about taking, courage in action, all of us know that there is fear, but we must often move on in any event. Melanie's a wonderful example for the Academy. So let's hear it one more time for her as I turn the microphone over to Melanie Wilson. And thank you for being our president.
Kelly, thanks so much for that incredibly kind introduction. I'm delighted today to introduce three really courageous leaders and successful people. I chose them because I think they exemplify and they personify courage in action, and I'm going to talk about them in just a minute. Before I do that, I want to let you all know that towards the end, there'll certainly be time for questions, we hope, from you all. There will be our staff, our AALS staff is in the back, and we'll be handing out cards. If you have a question, you can submit that question, and they will then pick it up from you and bring it to the stage, and we hope to address many of those at the end. I invited these three incredible leaders, again, because I think courage in action, I chose the theme because it's something that every professor, every teacher really has to exercise every day, and I think we can learn a lot from these three folks. I had planned to host a very free-flowing conversation among all of us, but of course, as everything changes, that has changed because one of our guests, the United States Solicitor Elizabeth Prelogar, has to argue tomorrow before the United States Supreme Court. If I had been her, I probably would have said, I'm sorry, but I cannot appear at all. But thankfully, she's agreed to appear remotely. And so we will be able to hear from her, and I will introduce everyone and then all of our speakers, and then we will turn to her first for conversation so that she can continue her preparation to be ready for tomorrow's expedited argument before the big court. So thank you all for that. Let me jump in without further delay. First, I want to welcome to my far left, Toni Massaro, Regents Professor, Dean Emerita, Executive Director of the University of Arizona Agnes Nelms Howry Program in Environment and Social Justice. Dean Massaro earned her Bachelor of Science degree with the highest distinction from Northwestern University and her law degree from the College of William and Mary, where she served as Editor-in-Chief of the Law Review. Dean Massaro was an associate attorney in private practice for 2 years in Chicago before she joined what is now my law school, Washington and Lee University School of Law, as an assistant professor. She held a number of visiting and other appointments at various prestigious law schools before she joined the faculty at the University of Arizona College of Law in 1989. At Arizona, Dean Massaro held the Milton O. Ripey Chair in Constitutional Law, and in 2006, she was named a Regents Professor by the Arizona Board of Regents. In 1999, she became Dean at the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law and held that position remarkably nowadays for 10 years until 2009. She was the first woman to hold the position of Dean at the school. A wonderful teacher, she often received the Teacher of the Year award, and she was a prolific scholar on top of that. Her work has appeared in some of the most prestigious law schools in the country, including Yale Law Journal, the Northwestern Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, and NYU Law Review, among many, many others. She recently took emerita status. To my immediate left, Rebecca Hanner White, Dean and J. Alton Hosch Professor and Josiah Meggs Distinguished Teaching Professor Emerita. Dean White earned her Bachelor of Arts at Eastern Kentucky University and her JD at the University of Kentucky, where she graduated first in her class and served also as the editor-in-chief of the Kentucky Law Journal. Dean White clerked for Chief Judge George C. Edwards of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit before entering private practice in Cincinnati, where she practiced labor and employment law. Dean White joined the University of Georgia as an assistant professor of law in 1989, where she later was promoted to associate professor and then professor. She was the second woman to be named to an endowed chair at the law school, and in her 13 years of full-time teaching, she was selected 6 times by the graduating class for the SBA's Best Teacher Award. In 2002, she moved to the provost's office, where she served as interim vice provost for academic affairs and then vice provost for academic affairs. She was tapped as interim dean of the law school in July of 2003, and in 2004, she was named dean. She served as dean of the law school more than a decade until 2015. She was the first woman dean of UGA Law, also my alma mater, and quite frankly, she was one of the first female professors that I'd ever had at Georgia. Finally, last but certainly not least, Elizabeth B. Prelogar, Solicitor General, 48th Solicitor General of the United States. She is the second woman to hold that prestigious position. She received her bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Emory University and a master's degree in creative writing with distinction from the University of St. Andrews before attending and graduating from Harvard Law School, where she served as an articles editor of the Law Review. General Prelogar clerked for Judge Merrick B. Garland, then of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, after law school, before clerking for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and then Justice Elena Kagan of the United States Supreme Court. General Prelogar worked at Hogan Lovells LLP as an associate attorney and at Cooley LLP as a partner handling appellate litigation. She also served as acting Solicitor General and as an assistant to the Solicitor General for 5 years. On August 11, 2021, President Joe Biden nominated her for the position of Solicitor General, and she was confirmed by the United States Senate and was sworn in by the Attorney General Garland on October 29, 2021. And I am truly, truly honored to welcome all of you. Thank you all so much for taking part in this great panel. General Prelogar, I know your time is limited, so we're going to jump right in. Thank you so much for making time for us in your incredible schedule. So the first thing I want to ask is, you personally brief cases, you argue numerous cases, you've appeared before the United States so many times, you assist others in doing briefs, you decide who argues cases. Talk a little bit about your guiding principles as you perform your responsibilities, please.
Sure, and let me just say at the outset, Dean Wilson, that I am delighted to join all of you today. Thank you for bearing with me and my crazy schedule and the fact that I couldn't be there in person because of this unexpected Supreme Court argument tomorrow, but I'm really delighted to have the chance to have this conversation today. So guiding principles in the office, you touched on it exactly in identifying all of the various stages of litigation we're involved in and decisions that have to be made along the way. I guess I think of the overarching objective of the Solicitor General's office to be to do our best job possible in defending the interests of the United States in appellate litigation across the country. And the way that that gets distilled into individual decisions is to always take a close look at the legal arguments we're making, to think hard about the merits of those arguments and whether we're advancing a reasonable position about the law, but then also to think very carefully about the interests of the United States. And one thing that is so special and such an honor about being a government lawyer is that the United States is a really special client. It's not like you can always ex ante identify with precision exactly what legal arguments are going to best serve the interests of the federal government and of this nation's people. And in a lot of cases, there are just cross-cutting equities because we have enforcement responsibilities, we have defensive interests, we have different stakeholders around the federal agencies. And to try to undertake that process of implementing this guiding principle, the thing that is most important to me is to try to solicit all views and recommendations far and wide. We have this own internal due process that we apply where we really try to drill down and make sure that we are having an opportunity for internal discussion about the various ways that different legal issues can impact the operations of the federal government and take all of that into account in crafting our legal positions in the courts.
So you have a lot of fans that are in this room that are across legal education. I am one of the huge fans. I was listening recently to a Strict Scrutiny podcast with hosts Leah Littman and Kate Shaw, and on there was Pam Carlin from Stanford, and they were all basically talking about how, you appear before the Supreme Court, and oftentimes the justices aren't the kindest, gentlest to you. And yet you stay so respectful, you go toe-to-toe, you don't back down. Talk a little bit about how you manage that and how you approach that and how you keep your calm and how, some of us might take a different approach even if we didn't mean to.
So I can say with total sincerity that I really view oral argument as a chance to have a conversation with the justices, or at least if it's going well, it's less about them, yelling at us because of our positions and more about really trying to engage and listen to their concerns about our legal positions so that I can do whatever is within the realm of reason in trying to defend our interests and explain to the court why we think they should rule our way. And, in some cases, there are obvious headwinds, and I have to walk into court in high-profile cases with positions that I know, based on the court's prior jurisprudence, might be a stretch. But I honestly think that the best way to have a good argument is to listen hard and view every question as a good faith effort to get more information and to have a chance to try to assuage whatever concerns the justices have. I get asked a lot about limiting principles in our cases. A lot of times the justices' questions are trying to press on not how our arguments might cash out based on the actual facts before them, but based on what could come down the road in the future. And I think that that is a really welcome opportunity for me to try to talk through those issues and be responsive to the kinds of concerns that might motivate the justices to cast their vote in a particular way. And I sometimes get asked, do you think oral argument even matters? And I absolutely think it does. Maybe not always with the bottom line. The written briefs are the most I think, important input into how the justices are thinking about the case, because it's the complete opportunity to set out your theory of the case. But I think oral argument is a really important component of the decision-making process in terms of the court understanding where you're drawing lines, what kinds of concessions you might be willing to make, and in sometimes helping to shape how the court ultimately goes about drafting an opinion in the case.
One of the things you said is you sometimes knew that you would face headwinds, and I think that's right. You know, you're not known for shying away from the tough cases. There may be cases that are clearly coming before the court, and the commentators and experts are saying that, you know, the government is likely to lose. Oftentimes you take those. How do you decide which cases to take, which cases to delegate? Does that play into the fact that, you know, do you take the cases because there are headwinds, or you know, how does that work?
Sure. So, you know, we have a long-standing tradition in the office of the Solicitor General usually arguing once per sitting. It's not an inflexible rule. There have been certain sittings where I argued more than once, and sometimes sittings where I sat it out altogether. But the basic principle in the office is the SG should be getting up in court once a month and defending the interests of the United States in whatever case is most important to the federal government that month. And a lot of times that turns out to be the case that is most important to the world at large, or the case that's garnering the most public attention, but actually not always. You know, I had a sitting a couple of terms back now where I chose to argue a case that I think was not on the radar of your average American, but which presented really important issues for the federal government when it comes to threshold doctrinal issues like standing, and when it comes to back-end questions of remedy. And the case teed up some really fundamental questions about those doctrines that weren't, you know, hot button in the sense of being a socially divisive issue, but were issues on which the federal government has a really profound interest. And I decided in that sitting that that was the most important case for the United States.
To me, that's part of courage, right? To take on those really tough cases, especially when you could choose not to argue those. The other thing is, I've gone back and, you know, I listened to some cases as you argue them, and I went back and heard others, and I truly am amazed at the breadth and depth of your knowledge when confronted, and when, you know, it's obviously a very stressful time when you're on the hot seat and you don't know exactly what's coming. How do you prepare? How are you so prepared? I mean, you do have a reputation for being incredibly prepared, but is there a special process? Is there something the rest of us can learn from that breadth of knowledge, that depth of knowledge, and just how you go about it?
Well, at the outset, I am really incredibly aided by having an amazing team throughout the federal government that helps me get ready for argument. You know, one of the challenges, I think, of being a lawyer on behalf of the United States is that the Supreme Court holds you accountable for understanding how everything the federal government does works. We're understanding all of the nuances of a particular statutory scheme. And in my office, we're all generalists, which I love. You know, we're not specialists in any particular subject matter, but instead have a specialty in appellate and Supreme Court litigation as a general matter. So what that means is when I'm arguing a case in a new area, I am absolutely reliant and dependent on the subject matter experts within the federal government to get me up to speed, to answer some questions. I think I have to be not afraid to ask seemingly dumb questions or basic questions, because the Supreme Court justices are generalists too, and they might have some of those very same questions about fundamentals of how the federal government is conducting its operations. So a big part of my prep process is to really make sure I'm asking the right questions from our federal agencies, our clients in the case, and from the relevant components in DOJ who have the day-to-day expertise in handling a particular subject matter. And then from there, you know, the thing about oral argument in the Supreme Court is there is a sense in which it's wildly unpredictable, because you have 9 justices who are asking questions in a free-flowing format. But the task you're assigned is itself something that you can get ready for and predict, insofar as you know heading in it's going to be a very substantive back and forth. And the way I try to structure my prep is to think hard about the questions and then think harder still about the answers. So I do a lot of talking out loud to myself in my office. I'm not trying to memorize answers because I don't think you want to get locked into presenting your case in a particular way. But I always think of it as trying to just develop a level of fluency in my case so that I'm ready for whatever the justices throw at me, and I have the basic subject matter knowledge base and the basic familiarity with the architecture of our arguments that I can be nimble in trying to be responsive in the moment. And it translates into a lot of hours spent thinking hard about answers, working with my team on refining the basic structural steps in our arguments, and then going through extremely rigorous moot courts within my office. I think OSG is legendary for the moot court process often being more challenging than the real argument itself. And that is definitely our goal, because once you've been put through your paces there, you're ready to take it into court.
It sure shows. It sure shows. The theme for this year, as you know, for the meeting and for the year for the Association of American Law Schools is Courage in Action. And I can only imagine that you've had to exercise courage multiple times in your role. But can you give us a couple examples of where you reflect and think, I really did have to dig deep and exercise courage in these situations?
Yes, that's a great question. I don't know if courage is the right label to attach to it, but the thing that immediately jumped to mind, and something that maybe isn't well known about the responsibility of the Solicitor General, is that a large part of my job is to say no. It's often the case that we will have different stakeholders, different agencies around the federal government who are coming to a legal issue with different fundamental equities. And I touched on that before when I talked about our decision-making process, but I think it might be surprising to really understand how frequently the decisions are difficult, because there's not necessarily any one right answer. And it could be very reasonable to support the petitioner in a case because of certain interests of the federal government, but equally reasonable to support the respondent in a case. And so our interests don't always line up on the same side of the V or point in the same direction. And I had mentioned that I therefore really welcome having this very robust internal process to ventilate those issues. I never want to make a decision that someone after the fact will say, she wasn't even thinking about this particular thing, or she didn't even know that it could jeopardize the interests of the federal government in this other corner area of the law. I want to get all of the information out there on the table. But what I've learned in serving in this role for almost 4 years exactly is that sometimes once you have all of the information, it comes down to an exercise of judgment. And there is no one right answer or responsible way to resolve the issue for the United States. And so I've had to grow comfortable in my own skin in recognizing that I am the actor within our federal government who's been charged with exercising that judgment, and at the end of the day, making the call and standing behind what I have determined is going to be the interest of the United States. And that might mean saying no to the secretary of a particular agency. I will say I always then try to call the agency and try to talk through my thinking, because I do think that it's important that everyone knows they were heard. And I want to sometimes walk through why I came out a certain way. But it can be hard and challenging to say no, and I have to do that a lot.
As a dean of a law school, I completely relate to that. So you're the 48th U.S. Solicitor General, but only the second woman. Do you feel like gender plays a role in your job at all, or how you're perceived, or how you run your office? Because you're obviously also in charge of a very large office.
It is, I think a remarkable and kind of demoralizing fact that the position of Solicitor General has been around for over 150 years. This is not any kind of newfangled position in the federal government. And prior to my service as SG, there had only been 1 year in that 150-year history where the office was led by a woman. And of course, it was Elena Kagan who became a Supreme Court Justice, and who you all, I'm sure, know as the former Dean of Harvard Law School. And I reflect on that a lot. It is, I think, reflective of a broader disparity that exists in the Supreme Court bar, as it exists in so many other areas of legal practice, where women are underrepresented and minority groups generally are underrepresented. And that's obviously a real problem and a real challenge for the Supreme Court bar. And I guess the way I think about it in terms of my current position is that I have been given a gift insofar as I have a voice or a platform to try to draw attention to this disparity, to try to think about ways that we can encourage clients and organizations and law firms and entities to give more opportunities to people who have maybe been shut out of this kind of pathway before. And it's one of the reasons actually that I love speaking at law schools and have prioritized during my tenure here when doing public appearances, the chance to get out to law schools and speak to our next generation of lawyers, because I think we all know that there is that power that comes from representation and from seeing people who look like you in positions of power, because it makes you think maybe that's a pathway that's open to me. So I have really jumped at the opportunity to have that forum to speak about these issues and to speak about the work of representing the United States government more generally.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question, but for those who may have come in a little bit later, do remember that if you have a question, you can raise your hand and one of the AALS staff members will bring you a card and you can write the question down and they will come and pick it back up. So a little bit of a follow-up. Deans Massaro and White are going to talk a little bit about becoming law deans when there were very few women faculty, when there are very, very few women deans. Did you have any women, it could be other professors too, but any women law professors or deans that had influence on you in law school, or was there as whenever I was in law school, a dearth?
I certainly had more male professors than female professors, but the dean of my law school when I was at Harvard was Justice Kagan. I had the chance to take administrative law from her, which has come in very handy in my work over the past 4 years. And I then had an incredible opportunity when I was, kind of freshly out of law school to go onto these clerkships, as you mentioned in the kind introduction of me. And I had the chance to clerk for Justice Kagan during her first term on the Supreme Court. So I certainly count her as someone who has been a mentor to me, obviously a justice of incredible integrity, a law school dean who cared about students and our educational experience and went out of her way to demonstrate that in so many different ways. And she has been a really important person in my life in teaching me, inspiring me, and I think demonstrating through what she has done with her career, the kinds of impact you can have when you bring to the table kind of the full scope of your skills and talents. And of course, I left out that she was also the first woman SG. And so in this particular role, I constantly feel like there were giants before me, and trying to live up to what they modeled in running this office has also been an incredible opportunity.
So you've already, you're young, but you've already accomplished so much. Are there a couple things that you're particularly proud of or consider kind of crowning achievements at this stage of your career?
That's a great question. As I think about my tenure in the SG's office, I feel so fortunate to have been able to spend the past 4 years representing the federal government in the Supreme Court in some of the most consequential cases the court has seen in a long time. And it sounds kind of corny to say this, but I still feel this sense of awe every time I stand up at the podium in the Supreme Court and think, I am here on behalf of my country. I am representing the United States of America. And it is an incredible honor to get to do that and to have that kind of client where I really believe in public service. I believe in the mission of the Department of Justice, and I believe in making the right arguments for the right reasons and get the chance to do that on a regular basis in my job. So maybe that's the most public-facing thing I'm proud of. In terms of something that is perhaps less public facing, I mentioned it before, but I have an incredible team of attorneys that I work with. And I have really taken delight in having the chance, now that I'm on this side of things, after having received so much mentorship myself throughout my life, to try to pay that forward, to be a sounding board, to give advice and counsel to more junior attorneys as they're thinking about the next step of their career. And I have hired, I think, an incredible team of attorneys in this office, as well as those who were already here, to have the chance to work with them. So I'm really take great joy and pleasure in having this team of lawyers and having the chance to still learn from them day in and day out as we try to carry out our shared work together.
So you've been so successful, and you've talked a lot about your work. And one of the things that certainly students care about, and one of the things that we talk a lot about as deans with our communities, is how to stay well, how to find not necessarily balance, but time for self-care, mental health. Do you engage in activities with friends or family that nurtures that side?
I do my best, but I think, like so many people who are trying to manage family life and a demanding job, it can be difficult to find the right balance. And I have two amazing kids, two little boys. Actually, they're big boys, so they wouldn't want me to call them little. They're now 11 and 13. And they are incredible, and I love spending time with them. But there are obviously so many competing responsibilities that sometimes mean I have to miss the soccer game, or I'm not there to assist with homework in the afternoon. I will say that in trying to make everything work and keep it together, one of my best strategies has been to try to talk about my work with my kids. You know, we routinely discuss the cases I have coming up, the legal issues in those cases. It's actually incredibly useful to me to get the reaction of a 13-year-old to how I'm describing the case. I have this tradition the night before oral argument. I always try to leave work at a reasonable hour and go home for a family dinner. We eat exactly the same meal every time because I've cracked the code about the perfect pre-oral argument dinner. At the dinner table, I try out my 2-minute introduction on my kids, and they rate me on a scale of 1 to 10 and give me feedback on the introduction. So the first time I did this, my kids were a lot younger. It was 4 years ago, and it was a statutory interpretation case. So my intro focused on the statutory text, which said may, and my intro was about how the lower court said it was a shall. And I finished, and my older son said, "Mom, I give you a 10 out of 10 because that sounded, you sounded so professional. And I think if the justices read the statute, it probably does say may, just like you said." And I was relieved because, in fact, the statute says may, so he was right about that. But then my younger one, who never wants to be one-upped by his older brother, he said, "Well, I give you an 11 out of 10. That was," he said, "but I didn't understand anything you just said." And so I asked him, well, how did I get an 11 out of 10 if it was incomprehensible? And he said, wise beyond his years, he said, "Because we're a family and we support each other." I felt like, not even an SG can argue with that. So that is one technique to try to make sure that my work life is not completely separate from my home life.
I love that so much. An 11 out of 11 because we're all a team here. So there are a number of faculty in the room probably that are relatively junior in their years. And then we have a range in the room, right? Like we have deans and advice. I mean, you're practicing law and you're at the very highest level, but that things you want to add, things you want to offer for kind of the academic side of things.
Sure. I mean, as I think back over the course of my career, I think the moments in my life when I had the most opportunity for growth were doing the things that made me uncomfortable. And, there's this, I think, strong instinct to stay within our comfort zone, to always focus on the things we're good at and familiar with and where we feel like we can add value. But every time that I have been kind of forced outside my comfort zone and asked to take on some challenge where I thought, how am I going to do this? Or had a sense of imposter syndrome, what am I doing here? Why have I been asked to work on this? it has, in retrospect, been this incredible opportunity to further refine my legal skills or to expose me to new areas of the law or new facets of law practice that have ultimately paid dividends in, I think, giving me the background and experiences I had to draw on for all of the subsequent career steps. So I guess I would just say, for those who might be more junior and thinking about, sequencing different steps in your career, I would not shy away from opportunities, even if you feel like they're going to push you outside your comfort zone, because that can often be a rich and fertile ground for self-growth.
So I know we're running short on time, and I promised you I would stick to the time. But I woke up this morning and Bloomberg had kind of a little bit of a summary of your time as Solicitor General, and that TikTok tomorrow would be your last argument, et cetera, and it said that you had not announced what's next. And so you may not tell us, but I'm asking you now, what's next?
Well, I have not made any public announcement, but this forum seems like probably about the best one possible to say that I have accepted a teaching position at Harvard Law School for the coming year.
Woo!
So I am going to be teaching starting at the end of this month. I'm really excited. I had the opportunity when I was in private practice to teach a class at Harvard Law, and I love having the chance to work with students, and I think it'll be really wonderful to be in an academic environment as I, process what the last 4 years entailed and think further about what comes next.
Congratulations.
Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so excited to hear that. That's fantastic news for all of us. Please get involved in the Association of American Law Schools. Got to put the plug in.
Good job.
Hope you have a fantastic argument tomorrow. Thank you so much. I can't imagine the preparation it takes, and for you to take time out for all of us. We are so grateful. We're big fans. Thank you so much, and have just a fantastic argument. And we'll look forward to seeing you maybe at this meeting, and let us know what we can do to support you as you make that transition. That's fantastic.
That's great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to have to drop off for the rest of the panel, but it has been a pleasure to be here with all of you, so thank you.
Wow.
See you in New Orleans next year.
That's right. That is right. Well, that's a fantastic start. And let me say, I'm so delighted to have you both with me here today. I was talking to Deans Massaro and White, and I said to them that it sounds a little hokey, but I realize, sitting as a female dean, that it is the trailblazers like them that were the role models for me. Rebecca White was, we were talking about it, and either my first or my second tenure track law professor. I didn't have any female law professors that were on the tenure track in my 1L year, and I had a great experience. I loved my professors, but you really do need role models, and you guys are trailblazers, and I'm so grateful that you are spending your time here with us today to talk a little bit about that trail that you made for us. So I'm going to start out by pointing out that in 1999, Dean Massaro, when you became dean at Arizona College, I looked it up, and 10% or fewer of deans were women. And then when Dean White became dean in the early 2000s, we had gone up to about 18%. When I became dean in 2015 for the first time, we broke the 30% mark, and then most recently we broke the 40% mark. But it really has been a long road. And I wondered if you all felt, and I'll ask this question to both of you, whether you felt like you were in such a minority of women in the academy when you started in the academy, and then when you became deans. And maybe, go ahead.
Of course. I started teaching, I was 26 years old, and it was 1982. So putting that into perspective and thinking about what the demographics were, I was at Washington and Lee, which I loved. I was the only female tenure track professor. The only other woman was this fabulous woman who was the head of the library, Sally Wygant, a generous colleague. So that was what was expected. when I interviewed at big firms in Chicago before that, I only met one female partner. At William & Mary, there was one female professor, later joined by a second female professor. This is what was. The books were rarely co-authored by or written by women. The second woman I had at William & Mary was the first one to teach gender in the law. Sounded like teaching fish in the law. And it just wasn't something that, in your thought bubble, what came up, it wasn't a female dean, it wasn't a female law professor, but female classmates for sure. That shift had already begun to occur, and I think at the bigger law schools, the shift was beginning as well. So that was the norm. But it was a really cool time. I don't consider myself a trailblazer at all. I consider myself somebody who was always looking for the light that was being held up by the goddesses. And they were there already. There were cracks everywhere. The legal academy, and in the law firms, and in the world. And of course, Justice O'Connor I remember where I was standing on the street in Chicago when I got the news. And so there was a sense of, I think of, here we go. And don't be told no. Mm-hmm. You may be, but I think a lot of women in those days were reluctant to apply for things. And so for a long time when people asked me, how'd you get here, 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 I would say, well, I applied. And I was fully prepared to be told no. I had a very strong mother. She didn't have any trouble telling her 5 kids no. But she also said, you don't know until you ask. And there were wonderful, extraordinary male allies who very much wanted us to succeed and were looking for us to succeed, and I think had a vision of that. And so I'm grateful to them. So yeah, sure, but it was, looking back, and I'm not dewy-eyed, I try not to look back, but when I do know, I think it was perfect timing for me. The whole thing. I have had, I would say, timing, luck, and fit. I like being a law professor. I love teaching. I love writing. And for the 10 years that I was dean, it might surprise you, I loved working for the college, which is what it was. So luck, fit, and appreciating the jobs. You all have amazing jobs. Amazing jobs. And I, for one, never for 1 second thought otherwise, and I think that propelled me through it. I still look back and go, my goodness. And that there were a few women, did that put more on our shoulders? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the Solicitor General, she needs to be a dean. That was absolutely fabulous. Who's my client? What am I doing? And the responsibilities and being proud of those responsibilities. You have a responsibility to your students, right, all day long. But gender is a part of it, and transforming the thought bubble that came up in people's minds at that time about what was possible. They didn't expect to see my face there. You have to be real clear on that. The other thing I want to say is there were people I could name of the goddesses, but in terms of gender, Kate Bartlett wrote a brilliant article about feminism back in the day in which she said that what held all the feminists together wasn't we were all marching around thinking the same things. That's just ridiculous. But we were asking the same question. What work is gender doing here? And allowing that to lead to the second one, it shouldn't be the occasion of subordination. But if you ask me, and then I'll stop it and listen to someone better. When I started at W&L, there was I was, again, the one woman, and there was only one African-American colleague. And we would get together about every Friday. And I'd turn to Stephen and say, did you speak for your race this week? He'd say, did you speak for all women? I said, absolutely, because I know what every single one of you wants. And we'd laugh and laugh and laugh and let it out. So don't underestimate. And I think for him, as a professional, brilliant black man in Lexington, Virginia, and his wife, the things that got thrown to them to do, to be, to represent, it was just much larger than the others. And the same, I think, in a different way came to me. And you learn from everyone. You say, this is a privilege, this is a privilege, this is a privilege. So that's what I think about that question. I was not a woman dean. I was a woman who was dean. But you are seen as a woman dean. And if you don't get that, you're missing something. And you're missing part of your responsibility, I think.
Dean White?
I don't have a lot to add because my experience is very similar. I started law school in 1978, and by that time, about a third of the law school class, or my law school class, were women. And that was a change. I think in the early 70s, I know there was only one woman at the University of Georgia, Sarah Jane Love. One woman, my female law professor, Carolyn Brott, was the only woman in her law school class, and she graduated in the early 70s. But by the late 70s, that had changed. So I didn't really think much about it until I started practicing law. And then I was the first woman at my firm to practice labor and employment law. There were no women partners. For most of my clients, I was the first woman lawyer they had had. For most of my opposing counsel, I was certainly the first woman they had ever sat across from. So that was really an eye-opener, and I had not expected that. When I went into teaching, I didn't really think about how many women are going to be there. But when I got there, as Melanie says, I think I was the third woman on the faculty. And that was not just the third woman at that time. I think I might have been the third woman ever to have been hired there. But it was a warm and welcoming place, and the students were amazing. And I will just tell you, I went to the new law deans conference before I started teaching. And again, I hadn't given a thought to being a woman going into teaching until I went to that conference, and I heard horror stories about how students would treat women professors. They will be disrespectful. They will get up and walk out. They will, And I thought, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? I mean, I gave up a great career to do this. I did not find that to be the case, and I hope you have not. I found my students to be incredibly respectful, male and female.
Oh.
And yeah, I mean, and I think that, I think maybe times had changed from when some of the women who were talking had started, because I think they probably faced a different environment than I had. But I never experienced that at all, for which I was very grateful. When I became dean, yes, I was the first woman dean. There were not many women deans. I understand the women deans, you all had a dinner last night. We did that way back in the day. But when we did that, we could all get at one table. And that was, but it was nice. It was really nice to talk to other people who were in that same position who were also women. Because as Toni said, I never thought of myself as a woman dean. I thought of myself as a dean who was a woman, but you are a woman. And yes, it does, I think, affect the way people see you. And it certainly affects the way I think students see you, because they can envision themselves in the role that you have. And that struck me, how proud they were that there was a woman dean. And I will just say, I'm really proud, not that I take any credit for it, that two of my former students are women deans, Melanie and Merritt. So I'll stop there.
So I want to follow up. Not only did you start at a time when there were a few women, you became deans, and by today's standards, you remain deans, very successful deans, for a really long time, over a decade, each of you. That's a long time. Oftentimes, I think the average, at least a few years ago, was 3.2 years. That's probably a little bit longer now, but how did you do it?
I hope it was a successful deanship. I don't know. I mean, that's for other people to say. I know I worked hard. I tried. One of my predecessors told me, though, when I first became dean, he said, you'll be amazed at what you can get accomplished if you don't worry about who gets the credit. And he was right, and it's true. You know what needs to be done. You don't worry about who's getting the credit for it. You worry about getting it done. And I tried my best to do that. Also, I was a labor and employment lawyer, and I used to advise my clients, when I would counsel them, and I did a lot of that. Be fair. be fair. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna, and I don't believe that being fair is going to solve all problems or even avoid all problems. But I do believe that it can solve some, and it can certainly avoid a lot. And so when I stepped into the role of being in this leadership position, I thought, well, I should do what I told my clients to do, and that is to be fair. And I really tried to be, and I think that I was perceived as being fair, and that made it easier when I had to say no. And as Melanie says, yeah, you have to say no a lot. But I think being perceived as someone who was fair was important and helpful. And I think the third thing was I was not reluctant to make decisions. And I heard the SG talking about that. And that may seem like, well, of course, that's obvious. You have to make decisions. But you do have to make decisions. And sometimes it's hard to make decisions. And I think you gather the information that you can, you make the best decision that you can, and then you move on. And I think that was helpful.
Ms. Massaro, how were you so successful for so long?
I didn't want the job. We had a sudden departure that astonished me. I'd just taken the dean out to say, there's some stuff you've been great, but we need to work on, blah, blah, blah. And in my mind's eye, I didn't see myself as an administrator. Again, I love teaching. Scholarship is deep, monastic, fantastic, hard, great, and I thought, I hadn't been an associate dean, blah, 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 okay. But I put my name in because I wanted my colleagues to know how much I believed in the college. And I put in other people's names at the same time. And that was for real. And one I was especially keen on ended up going elsewhere, and I soldiered on, and I did it out of, this may be misplaced, but a kind of a sense of duty at that time. But I recommend if any of you are thinking about deaning, you do a lot more investigation than I did. Because the job you see while you're tunneling through in the roles that you're currently in don't give you insight into what deans face. And it's just a whole different job. But I think that that fact was part of to the extent there was endurance. So I put my name in, and it happened. It was the right time, and it was the right fit. I'd been to other schools many of which I loved, all of which I learned from. I chose the U of A, and I got life bingo. We interviewed a woman, I owe her this all these years later. Life bingo is when you've got the job in the place with the person, the work, and you have your health, everything in your health. Bingo, and then the universe says, I'm taking O or N, but I have bingo. I still, most days, have bingo in Tucson, everything. And so it was the right place for me. And I'd been there 10 years. And as an inside candidate, I went to every colleague, knocked on the door and said, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to apply. And I heard some real, you can't. And I sat and I listened. And I was much more, I think, open then because I wasn't invested in my identity as a dean in any way, shape, or form. It was great advice. Law professors tend not to be shy, and some of them were good friends. And I really think that's something that I took through it, was you don't have a team of people just going, yes, ma'am, or sir. If you don't have a critical group, a strong group of people, where you look in their eyes and you don't just see yourself, you won't make good decisions, right? So I think that it was that I really loved the school. I loved the faculty, I loved the students, I loved the mountains. They never let me down. I love my partner. She comes from an academic family. I had all of this was in place, and so that was a good start. But I want to say something. Things change. We have a process of review. It was really healthy for me. It was a 360. It was in year 5. No one had ever gone through it before me. And I got good feedback, and it mostly was like, keep at it. If you want to be a good dean, you're going to have to raise a lot of money. And that's not done with fleeting relationships or people who say this law school instead of our law school. People who don't know the culture, don't invest, don't understand. I think, it's hopscotch can work for some folks, but I think it's really hard to literally build things. If they don't think you're all in, and I was, they say breakfast, there's the chickens involved, and the pig's all in, and I apologize to the vegans, but I was the pig. I was all in there. I loved it. And so I think that was great. But in year 5, you were changing. The academy was changing. It was the say anything. Epic was where we are now. Rankings, right? The coin of the realm was time away from the podium, right? Fewer classes, right? More time for this and that. Centers, all of those things were ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. But the race for the rankings, I thought, was corrupt. And I was at a meeting like this and with a bunch of deans and saying, this is producing incentives, and these incentives are bad. And I went through the list, et cetera, and I thought there would be polite applause. No, it practically was fingers in the air. They were not in agreement. And then I saw it's rewarded. It is lavishly rewarded. Even if the things that folks are putting in those forms, et cetera, are not necessarily, I'm out there here, and it doesn't take courage to do it anymore, not true, not audited, not anything. And the academy, all of the professors, me too. You ignore those structural things at your peril. I went to a highly ranked school with fantastic academics and great students, or I would not have gone or stayed, right? So you can't lose that. But the way that things were happening then, I thought, you're not all John Sexton. And you're not all in New York. And I don't need to see your magazines in order to judge the work of your college. But it was all happening. And I thought, well, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what to do about this. And I also was worried about this in people being so enamored with innovation, right? Innovation's great, you have to. But if you take down a load-bearing wall, then watch out. Read Jill Lepore on this. You have to be creative, right? And you have to understand that the money is not coming in the way that it once did, right? You have to do all of that. But if you eat your seed corn, I was best friends with the Dean of Agriculture, then what's left isn't going to sustain you into the future. But I didn't know, I could see these structural things coming, and I thought, I don't know where we're going. Are we making horse collars? What's going to happen? And so what I did is I wrote to my faculty, to the faculty, and I said, you may need somebody who's going to take us to that next level. And increasingly, the younger people we were hiring are new people. They wanted it. And I'm like, I'm not your person. I am not your person. And they wrote back, and I have one from someone who was pretty critical of me and everything. But on this, he said, there. And I've been doing this a long time, and I thought, okay. So I signed up again, because a lot of projects needed to be done that took time and relationships and all that. So I finished up, but I was so not the person at the end of it for the future that we've become. And I'd get calls. I got the sugar high you all get when the phone rings. Oh, yes, And I said, no. First, you're not Arizona. And I can only be dean at Arizona. That's me. But also, you're no longer the academy I joined. And I still love. But where are we going? And you need people who can take us there. And that wasn't me, and I knew it. And so my time is done, and I went back to my day job. And for all of that afterwards, everybody in town says, I thought you were retired. No, I'm still working full-time. I'm a law professor. Right? But that's what happened. So I endured thanks to the oxygen I got from my colleagues, my president, my provost. And in those days, things were beginning to happen in terms of people not trusting institutions, including ours, but it wasn't internal. And there weren't legislators trying to script you. This is really bad news, and it's new. And we didn't have COVID, and we did a lot of things. So I had lots of challenges, but enduring was logical. The norm, you're the Roy Steinheimer. I met him, he hired me. I am Methuselah. But that was the norm. You knew you didn't come and go, right? You came, you did the job. And so I thought, I'll stay for another 5 years, but I was definitely, if they weren't ready for me to go at the end of 10, I think they were, and I think they were right. They might have been right in year 5.
Let me pick up on something you said, but shift a little bit, and then we have some already some questions from the audience, and I want to give them an opportunity to participate. But you talked about you got oxygen from the provost and oxygen from the president, and I get that as dean. Talk a little bit about each of you, please, and Dean White, we can start with you. Did you have mentors? Did you, either as you entered to become a professor or as you thought about becoming a dean, did you have mentors or supporters or champions that really helped you make it, that were meaningful to you? And talk a little bit about how you found them or how they found you.
Let me start with this university president and provost.
Sure.
Because I think for deans, that's critically important. When I became dean, someone gave me one of the worst pieces of advice I've ever heard. And that was this. It was like, what you need to do, Rebecca, you need to pick a fight with the university president so that you can stand up for the law school and show the faculty you're on their side. And I thought, that is dumb as dirt. And I am not going to do that. And I didn't do that. And I do believe that having a strong relationship with your provost and your president is critically important, not just for your own success, but for the success of the law school and your students and your faculty. Because, you want to become someone that your president and provost trust, someone they can turn to, someone that they know will be a good team player when you can be, so that when you can't be, and there will be those times, they respect you and know that they should give in to you on this one. I mean, I think as a law school dean, having autonomy is critically important. We're so different in so many ways from other units on campus. And making sure that they understand that and respect that and give you that kind of freedom, I think is critically important to your success as a dean. And so I would encourage those of you who aspire to be deans or who are deans to really nurture that relationship, those relationships. I think they're critically important. And I would say that my provosts, Arnett and Jerry, and my presidents, Mike and Jerry, same Jerry, were some of my best mentors and also closest friends. And I thought that was very important. Beginning in law school, I had an amazing woman law professor, Carolyn Brott, who was an incredible mentor. I've always had a bad case of imposter syndrome. I still have it. Why am I here today? And that may not be imposter syndrome. That's real. But she was there, Professor Brott, to tell me I could do these things, and you should apply for a clerkship, and you should do this, that, and the other. And then, when I practiced law, I had men. They were, of course, all men who very much encouraged me and put me forward to clients. And when I joined University of Georgia, so many wonderful faculty mentors, Dan Coonan, Paul Kurtz, Ron Ellington. I just think that, there's that saying, I heard it first from Paul Bagala, that, if you see a turtle on a fence post, he didn't get there by himself. I'm the turtle on the fence post. And, there are so many people, who helped me along the way. And, and I think that we all need those people. And I think, reaching out to them, appreciating them. My co-authors, Charlie Sullivan and Mike Zimmer, brought me into the Labor and Employment Academy and were critically important in that sense. And I've treasured each one of those relationships. And, and I hope, now that I'm in this other phase of my life, that I can continue to be a mentor to others, and because that's rewarding, as I hope mentoring me was rewarding to them.
Mentors, champions?
Long list. My family, my life team, I read to find them, but back in the day, two I want to just mention, and then with meaning no disrespect to all the others. Well, my first boss at Grafton State Bank, I talk to her still. She's 91. She was the best boss ever. But Barbara Babcock and Carol Rose. Barbara Babcock was a professional mentor. She was the first woman professor at Stanford, but she lived to help other people, young people along. She always called me kid. The older I got, the more that mattered to me. When she was chosen to be the first female Assistant Attorney General by Jimmy Carter, and they said, well, how does it feel to get this job because you're a woman? She famously said, a lot better than not getting the job because I'm a woman. If she was here, she'd have you in the palm of her hand. When I met her, we could have met in a phone booth back then. It was women's civil procedure teachers, like freaks, and it was at a meeting. She walked in the room, and it was like, oh my God, I just was in love from the first glimpse. But everybody was swept up into her embrace. She really wanted you to thrive. And she said things like you're saying, kid, you gotta stop writing like you're somebody's best research assistant. Kid, you gotta speak up. Kid, when they do this to you, I want you to say right to their face, that's outrageous. And then go home and think about it and call me. We wrote long letters, we became co-authors. I adored her. When she died, part of me did. But I try to hear it, but it's not the same. Some of the salt went out of it for me. Carol Rose, I'm very lucky to call a colleague, and I just spoke to her recently. Carol's very different in these ways. She's brilliant. She pulls other people out watching her at a workshop. If it's a pompous fool, I wait. And Carol will lean in and just take their wings off, boom, 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 and but she does it in a way that's so amazing, and she's funny as a stitch, and she looks at things from different angles. But they did a thing at Yale for her, and two of us flew in sort of a celebration when she took sort of retired status. She's still, of course, working. And they said, Carol, what's the secret of life? And Carol said, to be a decent person and to have fun. And she lived that truth. She was authentic. Barbara Babcock, when she died, every one of us who spoke said the same thing about her. She was authentic, right? And Martin Buber says, teaching is authentic communication. I think living is, I think teaching is, I think deaning is. I think, like she said, you got to be yourself, these roles. So the mentors I went for are the ones I felt like I could learn, but also kind of warm your hands in front of them. And they don't always look for you, but Barbara did, and I've been a lucky kid.
So here's a great, I think, question from the audience, and it's to both of you. Is it rewarding to see the next generation of women lawyers, like Solicitor General, Prelogar, succeeding so fully, and any reflections on how you have changed the world through the students that you have taught and been engaged with?
I didn't change it, but it is rewarding. I'm writing an article now with Margot Kaminsky and Rebecca Avil and my colleague Andrew Woods. And it's really, I loved orchestra, I love team sports, right? I love co-authoring, I love being around smart people much smarter than I am. When we get together, we have to make concessions to each other in the paper. Margot and Rebecca they're the next gen, man. I mean, they put it out there, and I would be still putting my voice up at the end of the sentence, or just kind of making space for everybody else. I'm so proud of that, because you got to be brave in that way in the world, and I think they're extraordinary. Andrew is too. He's a doll. I love him. He's fabulous. Don't take him. He's my colleague, right? But I think if there's been any way in which we've contributed, drop the mic.
Steve White?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just, one of the best things about being a law professor, and certainly about being dean, is getting to follow your students in their careers. And, I have found that to be immensely gratifying. And you really know that you have impacted people's lives when they come up to you. And it's happened to every one of you. And they say, I'm doing what I do because of you. I do what I do because I had your class and you inspired me. And that's something we all have the privilege of doing. And just to second what you said earlier, Toni, we're the luckiest people in the world, or you are, I'm retired, the luckiest people in the world to do these jobs. I mean, they are just, and I mean that, you're luckier than I am because you're still doing it, you know? I don't regret retiring, don't get me wrong. It's great. But it is just such a rewarding job. But what also was incredibly rewarding to me was I also got the chance to be the dean who hired a number of outstanding faculty, many of them women at the beginning of their careers. And one of them is in the room, and she's the new dean of the University of Georgia School of Law, Usha Rodriguez. And I think for all of us who are the first, we want to make sure that there is a second. And so Usha is the second woman dean of the University of Georgia School of Law. And I have Melanie, a former student who's a dean. I have Merritt McAllister, a former student who is a dean. And I have these other former students all out through the practice area, private and public. And gosh, I mean, what could be better than that, than to see these people flourish and think that maybe you had just this tiny, tiny little part in who they've become and what they do.
Well, and I can attest that you have. I mean, it's not uncommon that I reflect on you as my professor, right? Like, I don't always reach out to you when that happens, but I am positive that both of you, through role modeling, through teaching, I'm sure you've had tremendous impacts. You tried to protest a bit, but that's why I asked you to be here, is I think you and others like you have really, truly paved a path for the rest of us, for which I am deeply grateful, and I think a lot of people in this room are grateful. But there's still barriers to break down, and our next question actually relates to that, and that is, what can we do now to continue to break down silos, because we still have these faculty structures that many times women and historically underrepresented groups continue to have a lower status on faculty. So thoughts on that?
Apply. Apply. I mean, I'm not saying that's not true. It's absolutely true. That structure is there. When I was in law school, for example, then at William & Mary, legal writing was taught by us. Yeah. And I had a tough decision to make with law review versus legal writing, because if I'd been the head legal writer, I would have had tuition free, and I was, broke. There are things that are built into every job structure I've ever been part of, the law firms, the law universities, et cetera. And so making decisions at the doorstep. When I left the law firm, I knew I was going to, I took a pay cut, a significant pay cut. I was going to something where I thought, I think I will be happier here. And I think that would and my dad once asked me what did I like better, working or teaching? So I think as you work within institutions that need to be changed, and I've never worked within one that didn't, one has to sort of recognize what those things are and protect your own personal well-being and happiness and what you want to do all day long with your lives. And then the next thing is, how do you restructure it in a way that appreciates the different contributions? It's like the old thing about equal pay for equal work and then equal pay for comparable work. I mean, these are really, the employment lawyer will understand above anyone. But some of this is baked. And, you want to work for big law? Okay. Would you rather work so there's some decisions that need to be made within, out here, but don't underestimate, again, the privilege of the degrees that you hold. You are not powerless. You are not powerless. I'm a first gen, no lawyers in my family, no money, my mom was a dental hygienist, et cetera, et cetera. You're making choices. And those choices have some consequences, and so you may be signing up for more of a struggle in some roles, just as we did as women in jobs in which there was a different, it was a different, but I was very clear-eyed about it then, and that was a long time ago, and in the eyes of a very unsophisticated person. So you're right. First of all, you're absolutely right. The question is, what are you going to do about it in your lifetime? And you know, maybe some people have jumped and applied to a different role within their law schools, right? There's other ways if it's really making you miserable, I think, and you're tired of fighting. I hear you. I hear you. But I think there's some things that are also structural. Like I said, I was ready to leave the deanship because the structural things had become something that I did not think were for me. So that's my very unwelcome, I'm sure, advice.
Dean White, in the interest of getting to more questions, I want to ask you the next question, which is, there was a great panel earlier, they say, about teaching leadership, so I'm glad there was lots of good panels, to law students. And how do you, or how should we, think about using our classrooms to teach students to be better leaders and to lead others, especially around social change movements?
That's a good question. I think that we as law professors, or I will just speak for me and my law school, I understood quickly after I came there that many of the students that were at our law school would go on to be the leaders of our state. They are. You know, whether they are governors, whether they are attorney generals, whether they are in the state legislature, et cetera, certainly the leaders of the major law firms. So you know that you are, in a very important way, and I'm sure this is true in Arizona, having the opportunity to interact with people who will go on to have a lot of influence in the state. And maybe outside, but certainly in the state. You know, I think that one of the things that, well, I'll just tell one thing that we did do when I was in, this is a concrete thing, and it doesn't really, I think, get to the heart of the question, but, you know, one of our former governors who was a major supporter of the law school, Governor Carl Sanders, established a chair at the law school for political leadership. And it was aimed at bringing in, on a rotating basis, people in positions of leadership, former U.S. senators, et cetera, to talk to our students. They would take a class from these individuals about what it meant to be a leader. Because Governor Sanders believed that we were losing something in our state, and I think he was right, as lawyers were hesitating to go into public service because the discrepancy between the pay in the private sector and the public sector was so great. And so you were not seeing as many lawyers go into the General Assembly, et cetera. And he wanted to change that. And so we started that in the early years of my deanship, and it continues now. And so that is a very concrete and specific way to talk about leadership to students while they are students. I think the other thing you can do is, you know, is just kind of model the behavior that you would want them to exemplify in their own lives. You know, what kind of a leader are you? Whether it's the leader in your classroom, whether it's the leader in the dean's office, but you know, you really have a lot of influence over those students. You know, they are forming their professional lives from the first day they walk into the law school. And so getting them to think about issues and how they would handle issues. And, you know, I remember I taught employment discrimination. It's one of the classes I taught. And we were doing the sexual harassment, the meritorious decision. And, you know, talking about, you know, what lawyers can do when they're interviewing or deposing a plaintiff who is claiming she's been the victim of sexual harassment. And let's face it, almost all these victims are women. I use she advisedly. And just stopping and saying, okay, you can say these things, you can do these things. Do you want to do these things? Is this the kind of lawyer you want to be? Is this what you want to do? And I had a former student come back to me years later and say, that stuck with me. And he's a very successful lawyer. I mean, he does his job quite well. But it was like, I was never going to be that lawyer. And, you know, that's just one tiny, small example. But I hope that's responsive to the question.
Thank you. So I think we have, if we've got about 10 minutes left, and want to squeeze in as many questions as I can. We've got two really good ones. One, Toni Massaro, maybe I'll put this to you. Advice for the next few years. I was going to ask you if you have advice for all the professors in the room based on all your experience, but I think in the next few years, it's anticipated, I think not unwisely, that legal education will have some strong headwinds, maybe just higher education in general. Thoughts to the people in the room from your wise view?
Well, I don't know if it's wise, but be authentic. And you cannot defend what you do if you don't believe in it, and you can't do it from a crouching position. You really can't. I mean, if you're thinking about enduring, if you have tenure, come on, right? Or continuing status. If you don't be afraid. And think about what it is you're defending, but also don't be blinkered to the realities of the things we will need to change. This is not like we're just defending something that doesn't have fractures, et cetera. So get involved in it. And I think if we had a national coalition of people working on how do you do this, this is a conversation that needs to happen and happen, not just at the end of a session. I mean, this is a much deeper question, and the current deans would know this much better than I would. I haven't been in that chair for 15 years. I think it's always a hot chair. I think right now it's on fire. And I'm worried about the crouching, and I also think you all have to stop trying to script leaders in the way you can advise, you can inform, but this is new. I think it was the outgoing chancellor or provost at Berkeley said, this is new. Never occurred to me after 9/11 that I shouldn't say something, right? So, you have to think about it. She said, I consult the Solicitor General. I ask questions. I'm not deciding in a vacuum, right? But at the end of the day, you've got to stand for something and be willing to fall for it. It's just that your backup is a lot sweeter than most people. When you talk about courage, ours is a little thin compared to a lot of people in the roles where they risk losing things. You have a law degree. Act like it.
Dean White, the other topic that I know I raised with the Solicitor General and has now come up in a question is about wellness. And, it's focused on what can law professors do to reduce the stress and difficulties of their students, but I would just make it more broad and say what can the people in this room, law professors, do for their students, and what can we do for ourselves, and what can deans do for each other, and what can deans do for faculty? Just the broader question of wellness, and any thoughts on that? And I'll put it to both of you, but Dean White, you can start.
I found throughout my career that the biggest challenge I faced was the challenge of balancing motherhood, parenthood, with the job. And I've been at this for a long time, and I don't think much has changed. I really don't. I think in some ways it's somewhat better, but I think that it's there. And so one thing I would say is, to the extent you can, let go of the guilt. Let go of the guilt. I mean, yes, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes on the job. You're going to make mistakes at home. It's okay. I can tell you, I've got a 41-year-old and a 37-year-old, and they're just fine. And I worked full-time throughout their growing up, and they would be the first to tell you, we're glad you worked, But I think that that's just kind of part of it. And I think so, to the extent that you can find something that you enjoy outside of, your obligations, whether they're at home or at work, do it. I joined a tennis team. Now, this was before I became dean. I have to say that fell by the wayside. And I'm a lousy tennis player. I'm a terrible tennis player. I'm a terrible athlete at anything. But I loved playing tennis. I mean, I did. I just think that having some sort of physical activity that doesn't take a whole lot of time is a good thing. I think that trying as best you can to find some time for yourself. And that was how I found some time for myself. And I'm never going to say no to a glass of wine. So.
I'm the wrong person to ask. I had cancer twice and took the deanship after the second one, and someone came in and said, "Now, what's going to happen kind of if you die?" And I said, well, I'd rather be working when that happened. I think that a lot of these things where you think you're going to protect yourself from things, you can eat all the right things, do all the right things, et cetera. Life is going to happen. And illness is going to happen, and these things are going to happen. And so the question is, you're not going to get this year back or the 10 years that you're a dean back. So what do you want to be doing when it happens? And for me, it was meaning. I wanted to spend it in that way. And on the off time, when I didn't want to be filling out forms for the regents or those sorts of things, there's a couple of, I would reread, if you haven't read Radical Hope by Jonathan Lear, I recommend it strongly to you, especially in these times. If you don't have a life team that gives you the kind of sustenance that I'm so lucky to have and that makes you laugh out loud regularly and just, then you need one. Everybody needs one. And then there was a book, all the books on leadership, most of them I thought were just worthless for me. But there was one on resonant leadership. We were talking about this where I don't care how busy you are, Washington thought he could make time in the morning for himself. I mean, you got to carve that out. But my rule there, which manifested itself during COVID, when you only could have these little pods, and you'd sit across the table from each other, and you actually talk about things, right, in a deep way. At the end of the evening, I felt fuller, not like someone had taken the ice cream scoop and, I'd given them everything, and I was just depleted. So you want to find those people you can warm your hands in front of, right? My Barbara Babcock is an example, my partner for sure, oh my gosh. Some very few people in my life, some of whom I would have never met if I hadn't been dean. Alums of but when you find them, hold on to them. And however much time we have, we're here anyway, right? And with kids, we talked about this, I don't know, I don't have children. So I don't know what decision I would have made. But I'm sure your kids are great, because I know so many kids of women who worked. My mother, I don't think I'm great, but she was great. She had to work, right? And I don't know if I turned out all right. Keeping your mental health requires, there's something implied in that I'm not sure I have, right? I just be yourself, keep going, and take some time off for the things that you love, but find the people in the job that you love. And if the job is not something that gives more back to you, find another job.
I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you, Dean Massaro. Thank you,
Melanie,
Dean
for
White.
putting this
Thank you,
together.
great Kelly Testy. And thanks to all of you. Thank y'all.
I think you are.